Yeah, so it's probably useful for your listeners, your viewers, to just kind of have the lay of the land about the therapy professions, because it's a bit of a mess. Um, I mean, incredibly confusing even to people in the field. So the main therapy professions, there are psychologists in the United States. Psychologists have a PhD degree or a PSY degree. Psychologists have a doctorate degree. There's psychiatrists who are medical doctors, so they're physicians. Then there are many other professions, not doctoral level training, that practice psychotherapy. And then this is something your listeners really need to know. The word therapist or psychotherapist actually has no legal or professional meaning. Like in most states in the United States, literally anybody can hang up a shingle. You can hang up a shingle tomorrow and call yourself a therapist. It means nothing. So, I hear people all the time and they say, I'm seeing a therapist. My therapist says this and that. And a disturbingly high percentage of the time, and I then, make some inquiry about who is this person, what's their background. It turns out to be somebody with very minimal training and knowledge. So the field of psychotherapy is just awash in people of, ranging from people with, real expertise and training and experience, to the term is, the term has gotten into the language recently. Insta therapists, who are found in places like Instagram or posting, but Insta also means like they became therapists instantly overnight. I mean, it's very, very difficult for people to tell the difference between legitimate professionals and, people who did a weekend workshop or got a correspondence school degree. Mm-hmm. That was part of your question. The other part is, what is psychoanalysis? So all of the therapy traditions ultimately, in modern times, ultimately began with Freud in the late 1800s and the turn of the 20th century. What we call therapy in modern times derives from that, and just the notion that that suffering could be caused by what's going on in your mental and emotional life in modern times really begins with Freud, and the idea that we could treat suffering by talking aimed at understanding something about what's going on in a person's mind originates with Freud. Then, of course, from Freud on, it sort of branched out to all these directions, and there are different schools of thought that, that really define themselves in opposition to, one or another of the ideas that started with him. But in fact, if a therapist is meeting with a patient or a client on a regular basis in order to talk, that's the tradition that started with Freud. So what a psychoanalyst is after you've completed your training as a psychologist, you're a licensed, doctoral level licensed psychologist, or a fully trained board certified psychiatrist, or you're trained you've completed your training and licensure in some other therapy profession. You might then go on to get psychoanalytic training. And so that's the tradition. That's the tradition that's been evolving for more than a century that we can ultimately trace back to Freud. But it's the tradition in psychotherapy that recognizes that there's such a thing as unconscious mental life, that we don't fully know our own hearts and minds. No human being can fully know our own hearts and minds. We're not constructed to know that. The things that we don't know about ourselves can hurt us. And we have a method to come to know ourselves more fully and more deeply and become more whole. And the goal of this particular kind of therapy, this particular kind of work, is for the person to become more whole and more free, so they don't have to keep repeating the same painful or self-defeating patterns that they've been living out their whole lives, right? The goal of this kind of therapy is personal agency and expanded personal freedom.
And agency and freedom rely on consciousness, not consciousness as in I am aware, but I am aware that
if you don't know what you're doing or why you're doing it, it's very, very hard to change it, right? It's you don't really you don't really have the option to make choices freely when you don't understand, sort of the pulls and pushes that are going on, that that are leading you towards certain choices and leading you away from other choices. So part of this tradition is that the more fully we know ourselves, the more whole we can be. And what I mean by whole is there's parts of our experience that are known and parts of our experience that are unknown to a greater or lesser degree. And what this kind of therapy is really about. And it's what most people think of when they think of psychotherapy. Right? When you see psychotherapy depicted in movies or the media, it's this kind of work that people think about. So there's parts of our experience that are known to us and familiar. There are parts of our experience that are unknown to greater and lesser degrees. And the goal of the work is for us to become more whole by being able to claim or reclaim what belongs to us, right? Claim or reclaim a greater range of our experience. Mm-hmm. And, the more fully and deeply we know ourselves, then, the more freedom we have to make choices in our life. And it's really, really different than some other approaches that are called therapy, where the therapist has a sort of a goal or an agenda or an ideology involved, right? There's a sort of a priori notion that when we get done, the patient should be, less this way and more that way, right? So the therapist approaches the work with an agenda or an ideology versus the ideology of a psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approach is, right, the purpose of this work is to understand the person more fully and to help them understand themselves more fully so that they can live their life more freely. Right? That's the purpose. So we don't have an agenda for the patient other than the agenda of coming to know themselves. And again, there are different things that go on in the name of psychotherapy, but in my view, if that's not the purpose of the work, it's not psychotherapy. It's something else that may be being called psychotherapy.
So something like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, that's a very specific, from what I understand, it's a specific tool set for enabling somebody to claim more control, be less impulsive, or have a different relationship with negative experience or some sort of psychological suffering by, having some sort of stoic philosophy, right?
Yes and no. I mean, CBT doesn't mean anything anymore. It's become a blanket umbrella term for a very, very, you can get some CBT therapists on here and ask them. I honestly don't believe that anybody could give a meaningful answer to the question, what is CBT? What are the defining principles of CBT? And the umbrella is so big and it subsumes so many different approaches. I actually don't think there's a defining feature except, there is a sort of commitment that there's a commitment to scientific research, right? We should be able to demonstrate that the therapies are helpful in research trials. But there's something else that's infused in the ethos of this, which is compared to psychodynamic approaches, the focus is very much on conscious thoughts and beliefs. Right? There's an assumption which is actually scientifically false, which is why it's kind of funny and paradoxical that they kind of want to claim the high ground of science, while in fact proceeding from an assumption that scientifically doesn't hold up. And the assumption is that your feelings, your emotional responses follow from your thoughts. They're mediated by your thoughts and beliefs. So if we can change your beliefs, we can change your depression or your anxiety. Well, that's actually inconsistent with what we know about the structure and function of the brain, right? We have the different brain centers, right? There's, the frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex. There's the centers that deal with logic and rationality. There are centers of the brain that deal with emotional responses. And it's just neurologically not true that our emotion centers are under the control of higher order reasoning. In fact, the opposite is true. There's actually more neural pathways running from the emotion centers to the centers of the brain that deal with logic, reasoning, and beliefs than the other way around. It's actually psychologically more true to say our our beliefs, our beliefs follow our emotional responses than vice versa.
Yeah.
So CBT is likely to put thoughts and beliefs at the center. And psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy says, your emotional life, follows its own course for really reasons that don't necessarily have a lot to do with what you logically think or believe. And we need to deal with your emotional experience on its own terms.
What you summoned up is that brain with all these neurons and pathways and all this structure. How can this weird squishy lump of gray matter know itself, and how does talking help that?
Well, we don't. I mean, this is a source of confusion in the public and in the field, right? I mean, this is an ancient problem, going back to early philosophers, the mind-brain problem, right? Mind and brain are not synonymous. The brain is an organ, and we study it as matter. Right? It's object, right? You can put it under a microscope. You can look at it. You can examine its properties. You can do experiments on it, right? So we can differentiate between subject and object. If we study something, right? If we study something as matter, the functioning of matter, our relationship to it is object. Mind is different. Mind is subjective experience. It's a different level of discourse. It's a different level. Right? It's a different level of experience. And the relationship between mind and brain is very, very tricky. Nobody has ever fully solved that problem. An analogy I like to give: there's a philosopher of science who put the term supervenience on the map, and apparently it's a very complicated philosophical definition that I'm sure I wouldn't, but the illustration of it is incredibly simple. And the illustration is, suppose you're watching a movie, Star Wars. Every single thing that you see in the movie, without exception, is you're just looking at arrangements of pixels on the screen. That's just, a fact. Like, without the pixels, the movie can't exist. There's nothing in the movie at all that is separate from the pixels, right? So in principle, you could study everything there is to know about, the electronics, the engineering, the physics of how pixels work. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't know a damn thing about the movie. It tells you nothing about, the battle for the galaxy and Darth Vader and his
you might not even be able
to
get to cinematography if you just break it down. You could
not get to it, right? So the idea is movie supervenes on pixels, right? Meaning that, right? I mean, the movie is ultimately constructed of pixels, but it's simply a different level of discourse and understanding. And knowledge of pixels has nothing to do with, understanding and appreciating the movie. And, I don't know if the analogy is necessarily a perfect one, but I think you could say that mind supervenes on brain. And we have neuroscientists who are studying brain chemistry and neural circuitry and neurotransmitters. And it's amazing and fascinating research. But there's not a damn thing that's come out of that tradition of research. I think the NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, has spent, I think it was $20 billion on basic neuroscience research. And they haven't produced one single thing that's of clinical help to patients or psychotherapists. Right? And so they were operating on the assumption that if they studied brain, that would answer questions relevant to mind and brain both. It's not true. We've learned more about the brain. We haven't learned anything about human psychological functioning from all this.
Through that form of testing.
Yeah.
But
so psychotherapy, the kind of therapy I practice, is not a relation between subject and object. It's a relationship between two subjects, right? Subjects meaning two centers of agency, two people with a sense of sense of agency, with intentionality, with experience. Two people come together for the purpose of better making sense of one of the people's experience.
Okay. Yeah. And so when discoursing or entering into this mind-on-mind relationship, what is the guiding principle or the ideology, the framework, the agent arena, the network? Where do you start? Do you have like an idea of what a person is that you can help guide you on?
We have a lot of ideas, but there's something more important than that.
Okay. Where do we start?
I think we were talking earlier. Psychoanalysis is three different things. It's a vast body of knowledge, right? We have more than a century of writings over generations of theorists trying their best to shed light on the workings of the mind. And right, so body of knowledge. It's a set of therapies, plural, different forms of therapy that derive from this knowledge. And there's a certain ethos or sensibility about the work that's really, above and beyond specific therapy methods or, a specific body of knowledge. And I think your question is about the ethos or the sensibility. And the ethos and the sensibility is we are in the business of helping people experience themselves as an agentic self. That is to say, our goal is for the person to come to know themselves more fully. And central to the ethos, this is a word that's widely misunderstood, even in the therapy professions, is neutrality. The therapist occupies a neutral position. What it doesn't mean is the therapist is distant or disengaged, or cold. It means none of those things. What it means is ultimate respect for the individual's autonomy and agency. We are not in the business of trying to make decisions for another human being about what's right for them. We don't have a stake in the outcome or what choices they make. What we have is a stake in them understanding themselves as fully and completely as possible, right? To know themselves more fully so that when they make decisions for themselves, their decisions are based on a fuller understanding of all of the different facets of their experience, right? So this is really important. We are neutral about what the patient eventually comes to decide for themselves, comes to believe, comes to see as important and unimportant, who they choose to, be in relationships with. We are on the side of self-knowledge. What the person does with the self-knowledge is up to them. So that's a very important value in ethos. And, and I think things start to go amiss very quickly when the therapist comes in with an agenda or a value system of their own, and says, I already know before I know this person, let alone understand them, I already know what kinds of decisions are right or wrong or good or bad for them, right? So there's a difference between therapy done with an agenda, right, that's intended to lead to, sort of teleologically intended to lead to some, particular outcome or state, right? We could call that agenda-driven therapy. CBT is largely an agenda-driven therapy, versus what we call exploratory therapy, right, where the agenda is simply to understand ourselves.
Neutrality doesn't come easy to humans. I suppose that's something everybody has to learn, especially in the context of psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapies. Is that true? Or have you had to learn that over time?
Yeah, it's a discipline because we're humans. We're filled with opinions about, everybody has an opinion about everything and, of our preferences and our likes and our dislikes. And you can't leave that behind entirely. You can't say, well, I'm going to put on my therapy hat, so I'm not a human anymore. I don't have any values or preferences or assumptions about the world, or it doesn't work that way. But we hold on to an ideal that supersedes that in importance, right? So it's really a training and a discipline about how do I enter a therapy relationship as a therapist in a state of mind where, the goal is to invite curiosity and exploration and elaboration of the patient's experience versus to impose an agenda of my own. And it's, it's imperfect, right? I mean, our humanity always intrudes, and it should. But ideally, we always keep our eye on the ball. And the eye of the ball is, the purpose of this work is deeper self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And when the therapist comes with an agenda, a lot of bad things can happen.
There's an interesting tension between agenda and non-agenda, and then it seems like your idea of the human being is founded on this thing called agency. Agendas are probably related etymologically to agency, but I like that. As somebody who writes stories or who loves narratives, my conception of the human being starts with will, and then intelligence and emotions are on top of this will.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question, I got a little sidetracked here, but is there an overarching principle? In terms of the method, in terms of how we go about the work and the state of mind of the therapist, we really try to approach the work with, something a Zen Buddhist would call beginner's mind, right? Here is another, right? This is an encounter, a unique encounter between two human beings. It's not a set of procedures, techniques, interventions. It's not an assembly line. On session 1, you do this. On session 2, you do this. It's a process of exploration and inquiry for two people. And I'm coming in, and I might have all my own experiences and assumptions about the world. Not might, I do. But this is another human being who I don't know. Right? And can I set aside, what I think I know, and come to it with a place of Zen beginner's mind, to be receptive to what might emerge in this very unique encounter that's not like any other encounter with any other person. You never treat the same patient twice. You can never do the same therapy twice. And so the therapist really has to operate from a position of, what I would call profound humility, right? I don't know this person. I'm here to discover it. And then, I have methods and tools for how to go about the work of coming to discover the person more fully and helping them to discover themselves more fully. Mm-hmm. We go back to agency and with a metaphor. Most people don't know this anymore. The very, very beginning, 100 plus years ago, of the psychoanalytic tradition started with the simplest concept imaginable. And this is actually no longer, this is not central to psychoanalytic thinking anymore. This is past history. I mean, it's like, psychoanalysis today is to Freud the way evolutionary biology is to Darwin. He sort of laid the first brick of the foundation. But what we do today has evolved, far away from what Freud as an individual person thought 100 years ago. But here's the thing, really, the first brick was the very simple recognition. You'd say, in a sense, we are the authors of all of our thoughts, all of our actions, right? All of our behavior. I mean, it's us doing it. There's no one else doing it. And Freud made a really, really simple observation. And the observation was that when people talk about what they think or feel or do, sometimes they use the word I, and they claim ownership of it. Say, I did this, I thought this, I wanted this, I didn't want this, I love that, I hate that, right? So there's a sort of a claiming of agency and ownership, and we recognize it and include it as ourselves. Sometimes, and it was the same word in German and English, sometimes we talk about things that we think, say, do, believe, and we disavow ownership of it, and we use the word it. Right? We don't say, I felt this way. Right? We might say, it just happened. That's not really me. It just came out that way. It wasn't me. It was the alcohol speaking, right? It wasn't me, right? So that we experience some things, some aspects of our own mind as belonging to us, and we disavow other things, and we say, and speak about them as if they don't belong to us. Right? And that was the beginning of psychoanalytic thinking. And Freud used the words I and it to refer to experience that we claim and claim ownership of, versus experience that we disavow. And those words were later mistranslated into English. They became the ego and the id, but those weren't the words Freud actually used.
Oh, so the ego and the id have become encrusted with this narrative that
very
really simple,
very crusted. But the words Freud used were words that any German school child would use. I and it, and then he made a famous sort of famous saying that people don't understand this anymore, is that the goal of this work is where it was, I shall become. Meaning that the things that are going on sort of outside of our control, outside of our awareness, outside of our sense of agency, we want them to be included in our sense of who we are, and become part of our agency. So the fundamental insight that from which all of this work follows is we don't fully know our own hearts and minds. Therefore, we're not masters of our own house. And the more we can know ourselves, the more we can become masters of our house. Meaning, the more there's a sense of personal agency as we live our lives, go about our lives. Right? So it's less about these things happen. It happened to me. It worked out that way. Right? External circumstances are, responsible for, for our outcomes. More about how much can we include? How much more can we include within the realm of personal responsibility? Things that we have choices about.
And it could be the case that done the wrong way, this causes somebody to become hubristic or tries to swallow the whole world into the eye, say that it's all me. It could go so far as to become slopsistic.
No, I mean, done wrong, and surely there's a lot of bad therapy, but no, I mean, there's more to the tradition, which is our sense of who we are. We're designed as we're social animals, more so than any other animal. Right? Human infants have the longest period of dependency of any animal in any creature in the animal kingdom. So, our sense of self exists in a relational context. Everything about us psychologically is forged in the context of attachment relationships, right? We don't really, there's a way in which you could say, mine doesn't really exist in outside of a relational context, or at least we can't really know anything about somebody else's mind removed from a relational context. And that actually has very important implications for psychotherapy because, right, what develops in the context of attachment relationships can only be changed in a meaningful way in the context of an attachment relationship. So psychotherapy is much more than a set of techniques or interventions or methods. Right? It is a relationship. The relationship is the starting point. It's the relationship that makes it possible to do this work of exploration. You can't do it in a vacuum. You can't do it solipsistically.
So when we talk about attachment relationships, and Freud, we're talking about the very beginning, the very first huge pillars of attachment, which would be mostly mother and father too, but probably mother's the floor.
Mother being the first attachment, father, siblings, and being important early attachments,
and then it goes outwards from there. The psychoanalyst. I would never want to mispronounce that, but they have another role that could be, it could be just as strong, or it could be just as powerful, because it is a very intimate relationship. It's not a business transaction. And by intimate, it becomes a part of all of these different things that are very, very primordial in the human being. All the hydraulics of, and I use that word metaphorically, understanding that there is a hydraulic model, but just the eros and curiosity and love and fear and shame and all that stuff. And so the psychologist comes in here.
Love, and hate
and love
and aggression and and animosity, right? And destructive impulses. They're all part of being human. We can't disavow any of them. That goes back to this idea of I and it. People want to talk about their sort of hateful, destructive impulses as if they don't belong to us. Well, if we treat them like they don't belong to us, we're not masters of our own house. Right? They're going to come out in ways that other parts of us might not choose. So I just want to add to what you're saying. Yes, everything you said and more.
Yeah. And that sea of feels and dynamics, once you enter into a relationship with that as the therapist, as the analyst, I like the idea of, it seems like that neutrality clothes you or protects you from becoming absorbed into it or becoming too attached to all of that attachment stuff.
You do get absorbed into it as the therapist. There's really no way not to, but the real skill of the therapist is, can we be mindful of that as it happens? Is there a way that we can shift or oscillate between experiencing the relationship with the other person, right? We have to, can we immerse ourselves in the here and now of the experience? What is it like to be with this person? Without an agenda, without trying to direct them in some way, can we enter into the experience with them? And can we step back from being in the experience in order to reflect on it and understand something, in a way that might make a difference? And, I don't know if this is intentional, but this is a beautiful segue that you just gave me to explain something like crucial about this form of therapy that just isn't widely understood. We say that, the relationship is central. Right, central to good therapy. Research shows that the strongest predictor of a good outcome is the quality of the relationship. But people outside this field don't really understand what we really mean when we say relationship. It's not, do you get along? Do you like each other? Do you understand each other? There's something much more to it than that. So here's the basic concept. Our earliest formative relationships serve as templates, not necessarily conscious, but they become our templates for how we experience our subsequent relationships. And the templates are largely invisible to us. We don't know our own templates. Since they're there from the very beginning, from our earliest formative relationships, there is an invisible to us as water to a fish. Right? A fish has no concept of water because it's never experienced anything other than water. Right? So our earliest attachments form our relationship patterns that we tend to repeat and recreate in one way or another throughout our entire lives, for better or worse, right? And so psychological difficulties that bring people to therapy are rooted in relationships. Show me a problem that brings someone to therapy, and I'll show you a problem that's playing out in the context of relationships, or that is forged in the context of their relationships, or is interfering with their ability to have relationships. Right? Relationships are central. So we could say that the person experiences, looks at relationships, looks at self and other in relationships through these lenses that were formed from their earliest attachments. That has crucial implications for psychotherapy, because when a person enters into psychotherapy, they're entering into a new relationship, and they bring those lenses and those templates with them. And what happens is, in therapy, in one way or another, the patient, ends up recreating their relationship patterns in this new relationship with a new person, the therapist. They start playing out familiar patterns, not intentionally, not knowingly. Much of this happens unconsciously, but it happens consistently and predictably. And that's what makes this kind of therapy possible, because the goal of the therapy isn't just to play out the same old, if the person is coming to therapy, there's something about the old patterns that is causing pain or limitation or suffering. Right? So there's a decision point, and the decision point is therapy or something other than therapy. And what makes it therapy is we're not going to just recreate the same painful and self-defeating patterns with a new person. Because they're being created with a new person in therapy, that's what makes it possible to recognize them, understand the patterns, and rework the patterns. So the relationship with the therapist becomes a kind of a laboratory and a sanctuary where it becomes possible to see what we do in relationships that cause difficulties.
And so the therapist brings to light, or by asking questions or by signifying these things, they become conscious. And then is there a process of, once things become conscious, do we then tie those things to perhaps negative states? You're replicating this relationship.
It depends on
pattern,
it depends on the problem and the person. Yeah, it's not really that formulaic, but things that are happening automatically, habitually outside of awareness. I'm going to help the person to come recognize, to be able to recognize them. And, before you recognize them, there's nothing you can do. You can't work with something, you can't work with it when you don't know what it is. So, people come to therapy, and anybody who's been doing this work for a while, I mean, I'm still blown away by, the wildly divergent kinds of reactions that I get from patients. I'm the same person. It's not like I'm a different person from one patient. I'm me. Some people see me as some patients see me as a sort of wise, benevolent authority. Who'll impart wisdom and take care of them. Some people see me as an adversary to keep at arm's length and defeat. I shouldn't have an impact on them because it could only be destructive, right? So the patient comes into therapy and it's not like conscious necessarily, but they create a relationship in which they're treating me as an adversary, right? Some people think I'm sexy and alluring. Some people think I'm the dullest person in the world, right? So, we see there's it's an ancient quotation. I've heard it attributed to different sources, but we see the world not so much as it is, but as we are. And that applies directly to the therapy situation. I mean, the patient sees the therapist not just as who the therapist is, but they see them through their own lenses. Mm-hmm. And, what we do in therapy is we try to help the person to become aware of the lenses. And it may be as simple as if a patient comes with the expectation that I'm going to tell them what to do, that I know better. It may be as simple as saying, just acknowledging that in words. It's like, it seems that you're hoping that I would know the right answers for you, that I would be able to tell you what to do, and things would be better as a result. The overwhelming likelihood is when somebody approaches therapy that way, they've spent their lives being told what to do by someone else, and that's how they ended up where they are, and right with symptoms or feeling stuck in life or feeling or suffering or some kind of emotional distress, right? So their solution to the problem, right? Somebody will know what's right for me and tell me, and then I'll do it, is actually the source of the problem. Because it's gotten in the way of finding out for themselves who they are and what's right for them. So the work really has to start with acknowledging, you seem to have the expectation, or you seem to hope that I'll have the answers for you, and I'll know what's right for you. And, often the patient will say something like, well, yeah, you're a therapist. Isn't that what you do here? Right. And then an entire discussion unfolds around that. Isn't that what I'm paying you for? Isn't that, to give me advice? Mm-hmm. And then you really have to introduce the notion, but, you've had a lot of people give you advice, and it's generally not worked out well for you. Right? So the person is still a pretty far way away from recognizing that looking for someone else to tell them the answers is in fact causing some of the problems they're looking for help with. But that's a start. or the patient who comes in and, views the therapist in a kind of adversarial way. You'll say something and the patient will sort of, bat it away without even, it's not that what I say to the patient is necessarily right. I never tell people what their experience is because I don't know it. What I do is, offer ideas or hypotheses to think about together. And some patient will sort of bat it away, make short work of it without thinking about it, right? The idea isn't to think about it, and consider, does this fit? Does this not fit? How does it fit? The idea is to fend it off. And generally the person isn't necessarily aware that it's not their conscious intent, but they're doing it. So, therapy might begin with something as simple as, there's a way that you seem to be treating me as treating me like someone who might be dangerous to you, someone you can protect, someone you need to protect yourself from. What do you mean? That's not how I see you. Well, I understand it. It's not how you see me, but I can't help but notice that, several times I've suggested something for us to think about, and you've treated it as if it was something, like harmful or dangerous or potentially dangerous you need to get rid of. Like, what do you mean? Say, well, a moment ago I suggested blah, blah, blah. And, and it seems like, you couldn't dismiss the idea fast enough. And maybe the idea was wrong. Maybe it didn't fit you, but I can't help but notice that you were dismissing it before you were giving yourself a chance to reflect on it and consider it. There's a reason for that. And the patient might say, what's the reason? And the answer is usually, at least early in therapy, well, I don't know, but it's something we might be able to find out together. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why do we need to find it out together? Because the overwhelming likelihood is if the person is doing it with me, they're doing it in other relationships in ways that interfere with the capacity for intimacy, connection, mutuality, joy, right? They're living in a world that they experience as, cold or hostile or threatening in some way. Here it is in the therapy situation.
It sounds like you could be teaching through practice or modeling a behavior through discussion to enable people to begin to speak with themselves in the same way or start to question and have a relationship with themselves. And I wonder if that
is, yes. So that's one of the outcomes, right? That we learn a way of reflecting on our own experience to understand ourselves more fully. And one of the benefits of this kind of therapy, what I would say is meaningful therapy, is that the person develops the capacity to reflect on themselves in that way after therapy is over, right? It becomes a part of it becomes part of their own capacities, so that when therapy is really good, it's not like something changed in therapy and there you have it. It's done. The person changes, their relationship to themselves change, and all of a sudden they're able to, they have access to a broader range of experience. They're able to think about and reflect on their experience in different ways. So that is something that stays with the person going forward. And actually research shows that the benefits of other forms of therapy, more prescriptive or agenda-driven therapies, tend to decay after therapy ends. The benefits of this kind of therapy, psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy, tend to grow after therapy ends, right? Because something fundamental, has shifted psychologically for the person, and the benefits of that continue to accrue over time.
The knowing oneself, I think it was Socrates who put that dirty thought into our culture. It's a scary process. I just even thinking about myself as we speak and like starting to examine myself. I'm like, it's kind of scary. It's icky. And becoming in a relationship with myself that is based on, I want to say the word love. My dad just visited and we had a long discussion about his belief system. He's a Trinitarian. So he believes that God isn't one entity and created the world, but God is a relationship, and everything in the world that God's created is all in relationship, and that entire relationship is based on love. That's my dad's way of thinking. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I sense that too. Even though you're not using the same words, there is some sort of positive. Even though you say there's neutrality, it seems like there's a deep loving that's going on, that you're teaching and that you're giving. Is that true? Are you cognizant of that? Is that problematic even?
I'm wary of using the word love because it has such, so many different meanings for different people in different contexts. It's a very charged word, and it could be easily misunderstood. But yes, when we were talking about, right, there's the psychoanalytic therapy as a body of knowledge, as a set of therapies, plural, and a certain ethos or sensibility. And part of the ethos is we're relational animals. We're happiest. We function best in the context of connection, interpersonal connection. And, for most people come to therapy for infinite reasons, but for most people, most of the time, something is causing unhappiness or suffering or dysfunction. Most of the time, something is getting in the way of really connecting meaningfully and deeply with other people. Right? It's sort of very central to this. Can we, right, what is the person's capacity for intimacy and for mutuality? And what I mean by mutuality is, the person is subject, not object, right? They have their intentions, motivations, feelings, experience, and so does the other person, other people that they're in a relationship with. So one of the things that we're working for, one marker of psychological health, is a capacity for mutual relationships, meaning relationships, that relationships that in which we can bring the entirety of our own experience, in which we can recognize the entirety of the other person's experience, right? Two subjectivities right together. Maybe a kind of a crude way of saying it is, you can have a relationship that's a two-way street. You see and hear and understand one another. It's not one-directional. But without that, we're something less than fully human, or something less than our best selves. We'd say that the goal of the work is for people to be able to become the best versions of themselves. And it's not so much that we have this agenda or this goal, this is where they should get. It's more that we start paying attention to the obstacles, things that get in the way of people having that.
You said one of the first bricks of this entire chain of therapies was that Freud's insight that there's this I and it, and we need to include the it and the I. What is the other human being, and how is that affected by owning more of my it's? Do I?
Well, the more, yeah. So I mean, the more appreciation and ownership of the totality of our experience, the more we know ourselves, the greater our capacity to know somebody else. We're less insistent, I don't mean consciously insistent, but less insistent that the other person must conform to our early templates and play out the roles of our early template, play a certain role in a relationship. Right now, we can have ideally a more mutual relationship that can involve and unfold, on its own terms. Right, and that's a kind of freedom also. We have the freedom to fully enter a relationship with another person as they are, versus having to repeatedly play out certain relationship patterns where I can't see the other person as they are, or I require them to play a certain role. This is happening a lot in, especially now in the culture wars and their, cultural discourse. It's there's a lot of assumptions and projections about who the other guy is, and we don't relate to the other person as a whole person. We don't actually, I'm talking about the worst aspects of the culture wars. The other person becomes a projection screen, for us to attribute, all kinds of bad, malevolent, unpleasant things, especially bad, malevolent, unpleasant things that we don't want to know in ourselves. Like the other person, through the mechanism of projection, is seen as the repository of these things, and now we can hate them and feel okay about that. So that something gets damaged in the capacity to come to know another human being as another human being, right? Right. Versus as versus as someone to put into some pre-existing box that already exists in our mind.
That mechanism of projection is a pretty profound concept. Did that originate within Freud or his circle?
Well, this is what people don't realize. It's become very fashionable to bash psychoanalysis and bash Freud in particular. And there's two levels of misunderstanding in that. One is modern, contemporary psychoanalysis isn't Freud any more than evolutionary biology is Darwin, or contemporary astrophysics is Copernicus, right? So I mean, this is the only profession I know of where people read college textbooks, and instead of talking about the field as it is today, right, the textbooks present something that Freud as an individual person said in 1910. And somehow leave students with the impression that that's what people think and do today. Right? So that's one misunderstanding. The second is there's an enormous, the language that comes from psychoanalysis is just part of it's part of our culture and part of our communication, and people don't realize that it originated from that. So we have a lot of people, especially in the therapy professions, who like to sort of bash the psychoanalytic tradition, right? While in fact embracing, its sort of core central concepts, sometimes under different words. So sorry for the digression. Long answer to yes, projection is fundamentally a psychoanalytic concept. It's a defense.
Could you explain that then? Why is it a defense? Why do human beings do that?
So every single defense ultimately derives from the recognition there are things about ourselves that are difficult for us to know and acknowledge. It goes back to I and it. This is this is me. I say I claim ownership of it. And then there's it. There's things I do and say and happen, and I experience them as happening to me, and I'm sort of deaf, dumb, and blind to my role in it. So at the heart of the idea of defenses is there are things about ourselves that are threatening or discordant in some way that we would prefer not to know, and we have this vast wealth of ways that we go about not knowing things about ourselves. So one of them is if there's something about me that's unacceptable, and I can't allow myself to be consciously aware of it, what becomes of it? It doesn't go away, right? It's one of the things, if we've learned anything in psychology, out of sight is not out of mind. What we brush away, in one way or another, finds expression in some form, right? It has an effect. So projection is we have something about ourselves that we don't want to know. Suppose it's, let's say, our own capacity for hate or cruelty or destructiveness. We want to hurt someone. Well, that's very, very inconsistent with a lot of people's self-concept. I'm caring. I'm loving. I'm working for noble purposes. I'm interested in making the world better for people. I don't have these hateful these hateful feelings and impulses. Well, the fact of the matter is, if we're human, we do have them. So one thing that might become of them is, if we were to sort of break down what's going on unconsciously, these feelings aren't me. I don't have them. So where are they? They must belong to you. So I see in you, thoughts, feelings, impulses that I'm not able to recognize in myself. And, sometimes what so sometimes what I project doesn't even remotely fit. Right? It's like the person is treating you as a projection screen, and they see you and treat you as someone someone you're not, someone you can't, not even recognizable to yourself. And the more disturbed the person is, right? There's different levels of personality organization. There's higher levels of functioning and lower levels of functioning. But at lower levels, at higher levels of functioning, there's some capacity for reflection, right? The person might say, you're angry at me, and and you might say, no, I'm not angry. Well, but you're acting angry. And then you might have a whole discussion around it. But the person who's doing the projecting, there's some room, there's some capacity to call into question their own perception, right? To hold on to the recognition of the possibility, maybe I misperceived this, maybe I got this wrong, maybe I misunderstood something, maybe I read something into it, right? So at a higher level of functioning, there's a capacity to reflect on our own experience. As you get to more, disturbed or more primitive levels of functioning, there's a level of certainty, categorical certainty about it. It's not, are you angry at me? You seem to be acting angry, which kind of contains a question. You are angry. It's a fact. It's not open to question. In fact, it's not just that you're angry. You are an angry person. You are an evil person, right? You are a destructive person, and there is simply no room to reflect on that perception and consider the possibility, maybe it really doesn't fit, right? So one of the things that happens at fairly disturbed levels of functioning is there's a term for it in a theoretical term. It's called psychic equivalence, and psychic equivalence is a failure to appreciate that what we think and feel is not synonymous with external reality, right? Thoughts and feelings are thoughts and feelings. Mm-hmm. And, they may reflect, something, truth about external reality to a greater or lesser extent, but, they're absolutely not synonymous. What we think or believe or feel is not synonymous with reality. When our capacity to recognize that distinction collapses, right? We act as if we think it or feel it, it's factually true. It's a recipe for disaster psychologically.
When we speak about projection, we usually speak about projecting all of my shadow or all my gross stuff, all the stuff that doesn't.
Yeah, we tend not to project the things there's exceptions. We tend not to project the things we like about ourselves and, include in our sense of self. And the things we mean when we say I, we project the things that, we project the things that we want to disavow. So, generally negative.
So what about conditions under which, and I'm just shooting from the hip here, just remembering when I was a 16-year-old, total hopeless romantic, and I would just project all of this stuff onto one woman and then one young woman and another young woman. I wonder if there's positive projections.
Yeah, you can project anything.
Is that mechanic different than the negative projections?
No, not necessarily. I mean, we're projecting a wish or an impulse or a feeling. The example I gave about, hate tends to play out in public discourse, but, I desire this woman, I'm attracted to her. It's easy to project that and imagine, well, she desires me. And then selective attention and confirmation bias enters into it. Then we tend to look for things, that support what we already want to believe. Mm-hmm. And that's a pretty, benign kind of projection, right? That's within the normal realm of, of functioning. And then, there's more disturbed forms of projection that are much costlier. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's important that you brought that up, because all of these, sort of the idea of unconscious mental life, that we don't fully know ourselves, defensive processes, these aren't concepts that apply, to others. Sick people, disturbed people, people who need therapy. These are concepts that apply to humans, right? This is how we're built. We all do all of these things all of the time. And that's why it drives me crazy when somebody says, do I need therapy? I don't know what you need. Like need isn't really part of my thought. I don't know if you need therapy. The question is, are there ways that you're getting in your own way or tripping over your own feet in life, or interfering with pleasure, satisfaction, meaning, intimacy, in ways you don't realize? Could you benefit from, understanding yourself more fully? Right? And, the answer for most people is yes.
This might be out of the blue. It might not be. I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but I want to ask you, since I got you on the couch right now, what about humor? What's up with wit and humor? Is there like a conception of what that does for human beings, or what that reveals?
Yeah, it's a requires a pretty mature level of psychological functioning, because humor necessarily involves the capacity to step back and sort of step back and see ourselves in a slightly different light, right? And to be surprised by that. Okay. So besides being a clinician, a psychotherapist, I'm also a published researcher in the field. I'm one of the main researchers in the area of personality, and one of the things that's come out of our research is we sort of developed an instrument, a psychological test that it's designed. Of course, it falls somewhat short of the ideal, but it's designed to provide a really comprehensive picture of somebody's psychological and personality functioning. One of the things that we did with this instrument is we used it to study psychological health. And we came up empirically, not sitting around thinking about it. This is empirical data from studying thousands of patients and thousands of patient therapist pairs of what are the characteristics that make up psychological health, healthy psychological functioning. And so we, sort of got this list of what is it that knowledgeable therapists are really sort of working toward? What is it that patients want for themselves? And just coincidentally, one of the items on the list is humor, meaning the capacity to just, sort of, step back and take perspective on yourself and others. Front and center on the list is the capacity for, meaningful, mutual attachments and intimate relationships.
And so this is, you're speaking about functioning, or we're researching functioning. Whenever personality comes up, the first thing that a lot of people probably think of is personality types, and everybody's got like their Enneagram or something like that. Do you put stock in that? You were speaking specifically about functioning.
No, most of it is bunk. There are, so this is what I study. There are personality types, but they're not the ones that are in popular culture. There's right, so this tradition of therapy, we've had more than a century of people, theorists, therapists, deep thinkers, devoting their lifetime to observing and thinking about and trying to understand people, including, people who run into difficulties. And, over the course of many generations, we've come up with this typology, there are, in many ways, people are more similar than different. There are certain pretty recognizable, known personality styles. They're not diagnoses. It's not that there's something wrong with you. Everybody has a personality and a personality style. And there's 10 or 11 known established personality styles that have come out of clinical observation over many generations. The research that I and my colleagues did is we found a way to study it scientifically. And actually what we were able to do is confirm empirically, these personality styles really exist, but they're not the ones on, they're not the personality styles you'd find on the, I don't know, what's that, the Myers-Briggs type indicator. They're not what people are familiar with.
Okay. Do you have any, or have you spoken with any, theorists, or do you guys have any hypotheses of how or why human beings shook out psychodynamically to have these 10 different kind of types? Do you guys have any guesses about
Yeah, I mean, they all
evolutionary
have
fitness, or just how the brain
yeah,
is?
well, I don't know brain, but I mean, they all have developmental origins, and and are ultimately traceable to our relational patterns and our very earliest formative relationships.
So
And
they're more imprinted than emergent.
I'm not sure what you mean by imprinted versus
They
emergent.
they aren't wired in the brain. They're developed in relationship to environmental circumstances.
They're developed in
Human-
relation. Well, I mean, it's complex. There's sort of
probably
temperamental factors that we're born with, right? I mean, there are just differences in temperament, that are born. Then there's differences. Then many aspects of us psychologically are formed by the interaction of these innate characteristics or temperament, the interaction of that with our early experiences and our early relationships, right? So there's a very complicated relationship between sort of innate biological predispositions and what becomes of them as we start to be psychologically shaped in the context of attachment relationships. And I guess what you can say is that there are certain developmental challenges that every human being has to navigate as a function of being human. And there are so many sort of relatively expectable pathways that these challenges tend to get resolved, which result in personality types or styles. But that's sort of a broad. They're broad categories in therapy. If I recognize, here, let me make it more concrete. So in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, they took the personality styles that were understood in the psychoanalytic literature, ratcheted them up in severity, described them in their most pathological possible form, and turned them into disorders, because everything in the book had to be a disorder. How can a personality be? How can your personality be a disease? It's not something you have, like the flu or cancer. It's who you are. So the DSM already, really, really distorted how many people in the field think about and understand personality. Every single one of the personality styles has healthier and unhealthy variations. There's high functioning versions of every personality style, and there's low functioning versions. So let's take a paranoid personality style. It's a suspiciousness. It's a sort of underlying default assumption. I can't really trust what I see. There's something else going on beneath the surface. Maybe something nefarious going on beneath the surface. That's the essence, or it's part of the essence of the style. Well, let's think about healthy and unhealthy variants of that. If that's part of your outlook on the world, you're sort of always looking for, what's behind the surface of things. You might be a scientist, right? You're going to discover, unknown causes. You might be a brilliant investigative journalist. You might become a detective, right? It's a way of functioning that has certain strengths. Or if it takes, an unhealthy turn, it's an assumption that everyone you meet is hostile and malevolent and out to harm you. And then, right, then you experience the world as cold and hostile, right? And it's a pathway to alienation and depression, right? So, but it all starts with the person sort of organized around this theme of, I can't fully trust what I see. There's something more here.
That thinking about it that way. So I was asking, once we start to typify human beings, there's healthy and unhealthy ways of going about with that knowledge or producing that knowledge. And your example is really great because you could see that if given everything else being equal and there isn't like severe trauma, the difference between unhealthy and healthy or, productive and unproductive paranoia would have to do with the tool or would have to do with the perspective. Do you have a scientific toolkit to apply and to test your assumptions, or do you not have a toolkit to apply and to test your assumptions?
Yeah, I guess that's one way to think about it. I would say prior to that is what you and I were talking about just a little just a little earlier, which is, do you have the capacity to call into question your own perceptions of things and reflect on them? Or do you, assume that, what you feel is automatically true? They're different levels of functioning. So if you have a paranoid style, personality style, coupled with a capacity for, reflection on our own experience, coupled with a capacity for intimacy and connection with other humans, right? Then that style may be channeled in very productive ways. If you have a paranoid style, in the absence of a capacity to call into question our own experience and reflect on it, in the absence of the capacity for genuine interpersonal connection with people, then you're in for a world of trouble and symptoms. Another example would be a narcissistic style, right? I mean, especially on social media, people it's like somehow narcissist has become this like meaningless grab bag term for anybody that we experience as manipulative or destructive. Or I mean, narcissism in psychology means something very, very specific, and it's not that. Right? I mean, the way it's used in popular culture is just.
Not clinical.
It's not how a knowledgeable psychologist or psychiatrist or psychoanalyst understands the words. So, somebody who has a narcissistic style, a healthy version of a narcissistic style, well, that's the person who can, with the confidence to dream the really big dreams, right? The person who can imagine something grander and better than anything that's ever been before. They might become founders. They might become Steve Jobs, right? They're innovators, they're founders, they're leaders, or, an unhealthy variant of a narcissistic style. You're self-centered, oblivious to other people's experiences, right? And incapable of having a mutual relationship because you think the world revolves around you.
That is, you're forcing me to rewrite what I thought narcissist meant. How does narcissism give way to the big dreams and ideals? Why are we using narcissist as the way to, the myth of narcissist?
Well, because your concept of narcissist probably comes from popular culture. Narcissism, it's actually very complex. It's not one single thing. And if I said that, it has one specific meaning. If I said that, I misspoke. I think I did say that. I recently read a book about narcissism. The authors wrote, narcissism is like a many-headed hydra because it takes so many different forms and so many different variations, and different forms and different variations in the same person at different times and different contexts. So it's incredibly complex. But it's an investment in sort of positive regard in the self. So think about, I can do something, I can accomplish something that nobody else has ever done, and I really believe in it. I can build something that's never been built before. I can create something that's never been created. I can envision a different way of being that nobody has ever succeeded in bringing about before. Right? I mean, that takes a certain, narcissistic confidence, because so many other people would say, well, that's a pipe dream, that's unrealistic, right? Somebody with a healthy version of narcissism, I don't care if somebody else thinks it's realistic or unrealistic or pie in the sky. It's like, no, I believe I can do it. And they might, if they're sort of charismatic about it, they might get other people on board. I believe in you. I believe we can do it. And right, if it's a healthy version of that, maybe it leads to, Apple and iPhones. And if it's an unhealthy version of it, maybe it leads to, Jim Jones and mass suicide. Right. So, right, all of these personalities, concepts and styles aren't inherently good or bad, right? They're sort of psychological themes and patterns that the person is organized around, for better or for worse.
Why did you get into this? You seem like you really like it. How did you
Psychology in general, or psychoanalysis, or personality?
Well, what we're talking about, and everything that we're talking about, what got you on the path to doing this work?
Yeah, how did I become a psychologist?
Yeah. How did you know that was, or what was the moment where you started to feel you're exhibiting joy? When did you
Yeah,
become
I'm
aware
really
that
into
this
this.
is,
This is the most interesting and fascinating thing in the world. Why we are the way we are. Why we do what we do as people. Why we feel the way we do. Yeah.
and
You're
that why
right.
could you could get into philosophy rather than this. That why is a big prompt. Why did this
Well,
seem satisfying?
philosophy, kind of operates. My understanding, I don't, I don't have a deep background in philosophy, so maybe a real philosopher would say otherwise. But philosophy operates, at a level of abstraction. Where psychology operates at the level of very personal.
You could have become a novelist instead, because
Yeah,
literature kind of.
but I'm way too lazy to work that hard. I'll tell you a story. I've told it on a podcast before. It's a personal, embarrassing, but I've told it before. I'll tell it here. So I was a college student. I actually didn't start off as a psychology major. I was an economics major, largely because I didn't really understand then what a psychologist was. like I thought when I was in high school, I thought like a psychologist was something like a second-rate psychiatrist, and I wasn't interested in medicine. I knew I didn't want to be a medical doctor. Like blood and guts makes me queasy, and I knew I wasn't going to be a second-rate anything. So I never even considered studying psychology, but I was fascinated by it. And I read books about psychology when I was a child. I read books about dreams, and if there was a single turning point, that kind of crystallized things was an experience I had. So I was about 18 or 19. I had my first girlfriend, first true love. And let's see, should I give you the punchline first or the lead-in to this was that we had sex and the condom broke. And then her period was late. So we were absolutely 100% convinced she was, pregnant and terrified. At least I was terrified. In those days, they didn't have a home pregnancy test. You had to go to the doctor and get a test, and we had to wait, a few days for the results. Turned out she wasn't pregnant, but the day before she was supposed to get the test results, she had a dream, and she told me the dream, and I had become friendly with this crusty old psychology professor because I was so interested, and I used to hang around with him, waiting for whatever pearls of wisdom he might bestow upon me. And we become friendly. And I told him my girlfriend's dream. I didn't tell him what he didn't know. He didn't know that it was my girlfriend's dream. He didn't know anything about the broken condom or our fear that she was pregnant. I don't think he even knew that I had a girlfriend. I just said, I said, somebody told me this dream. It's really interesting. And so the dream was we were, she and I were in a car together, and we were driving, and we were driving over bridges, like over water, lakes or rivers or something, or crossing bridges. And that was the first scene in the dream. And then the scene changed, and we were in a store, a hat shop, and she was there with me, and I was trying on hats one after another. And there was more. It went on from there, but that's as far as I got before the professor interrupted me. And he was very formal. He called me Mr. Shedler. He said, Mr. Shedler. This is not, by the way, an example of good psychotherapy, but this is how it happened. He says, water represents birth. Crossing over water, driving over bridges, and not being in the water represents a wish to avoid birth, to avoid pregnancy. Covering your head with a hat represents covering the head of your penis with a condom. Because now he didn't even know I had a girlfriend. And he says, the dream expresses your girlfriend's wish to avoid getting pregnant by having you use a condom properly. Well, he didn't know the backstory. And it was it just blew me away. I mean, if the professor's words were, heralded by celestial trumpets, I couldn't have been more surprised. I'm like, oh my God. it's true. Right? Dreams, they're not random neural dreams, have meaning. Mm-hmm. The life of the mind has meaning. We can understand it, right? And I had this sense, if there are people in the world who understand things like this, I want to be one of them. For the benefit of your viewers, that is not the way you go about handling dreams in psychotherapy. But it had a big impression. He shot from the hip, but he got it right.
That capacity of intuition that I think is at the heart of that story, having the reins on one's. Have you been able to develop and watch yourself develop that capacity to tune into things or to just have things pop up?
Yeah, well, he had a lot to draw on, a lot of information that I didn't realize. I actually did. A few years later, I became a grad student in psychology, and part of what I did was I was a TA in psychology classes, and I duplicated that experience with somebody else telling me a dream on multiple occasions. I don't do that anymore. I mean, there's something, sort of rushing in to, give somebody a dream interpretation is not really what the work is about.
Especially if they're not going to pay you first or afterwards, right?
Well, even if they ask for it, it's kind of falls in the category of it's a little showy, it's show offy, it's kind of more in the category of a pretty cool parlor trick, but still a parlor trick. It's not the essence of what we do in psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. But I remember somebody, college sophomore told me a dream in class. We were studying dreams. There was a context for it. And maybe you'll be able to interpret this because I'm laying it out so transparently. It's taking off in an airplane. It was on a flight. And it was supposed to land, but there was some uncertainty about where to land, whether it was supposed to land in this city or that city. So it kept flying back and forth between two cities, and the dream ended there. It's like they never figured out where they were supposed to land. And airplanes and flying are, often stand in for sexual relationships anyway. So I did the show offy thing. I'm a little embarrassed about it now. And I said, you're interested in two different women and you're not sure which one to pursue. And the guy, he just, how did you know that? And it's like, well, it was in the dream.
So, you're doing a lot of work. Do you have resources? Would you like to plug something that's coming up, or where people can find more of your research or your talks, or do you have a lecture series coming up? Something like that?
I am probably the only person on social media that you're likely to talk to who is not selling anything. If there's some videos of me that are out, they're not for sale. You can just access them for free. I have a website. It's my name, jonathanshedler.com. On the website, there's a menu. It says writings, and some of my more popular articles, both for other mental health professionals and for the general public, are on there. But they're all free to download PDFs. There's some links to videos of me talking about different things about psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. I don't have anything to plug or sell.
Well, is there like a big research that's going to change our minds about our minds that's on the horizon that you're working on behind the scenes? You can just say that you're not allowed to talk about it. Yeah.
I'm not sure anybody's mind gets changed based on. Two things. It's the hardest thing in the world it's the easiest thing to say. It's the hardest thing in the world to grasp. When we say there's really such a thing as unconscious mental life. meaning that in very, very important ways, we don't fully know our hearts and minds. I know I've repeated that several times today. It's easy to say, for that to really sink in, to really get that, we don't fully know who we are. We can come to understand ourselves in the world very differently. That happens in the context of a one-to-one relationship. I don't really believe that there's anything I can put out there in the world, and someone will read something or see a video that I don't really believe that somebody would get it. Not in an intellectual, cognitive way. Of course, they would get it in a way that sinks in and really makes a difference. I think that kind of change happens in meaningful psychotherapy. Maybe there's one thing I am doing. I guess I'll mention this because it's more for the public. Most of what I do is aimed at other mental health professionals. I developed a mental health test. It's called PsychScan. Psych, P-S-Y-C-H -scan.com. And it's really intended for other therapists. It's a pretty comprehensive picture of a person with respect to diagnostic categories. So if you're a therapist and you want a tool that will give you, Kent doesn't do the work of therapy for you, but it will give you the sort of landmarks of the territory of where somebody is struggling. Right? This test will do it. It'll take about 10 minutes. It uses artificial intelligence, so it doesn't ask stupid questions that are irrelevant. And when you're done, if you would meet criteria for a particular psychiatric diagnosis, it would tell you depression, anxiety, panic attacks, substance use disorder. So that's something that's available for the public. Most of what I do is really for other mental health professionals.
There is a power in all of the language and the concepts that your profession from Freud onward has in our popular imagination. And speaking to you has been helpful for me to kind of loosen up the abuses that certain words or types of thinking about psychology or through psychology of other people. It's helped me kind of reframe that. It's easy for this stuff to get weaponized. Diagnostic tools, it can be taken into the public sphere. And like you were talking about narcissism, it's really easy for us to categorize and then actually perform these negative things that psychology is trying to get us to not behave or to do. So I guess just to sum up, what is the guiding principle that allows all of these tools to not become weapons? And I know that a tool can be a weapon or not a weapon depending on the person.
I think they do become weapons, that unfortunately. Generally, I mean, not so much among well-trained mental health professionals that I respect. We understand that we're in the business of understanding people and helping them understand themselves. It's not about judging or evaluating or diagnosis has a function, but it's not about diagnosing what's wrong with you, you have a disease. But less trained mental health professionals use the terms in ways that can be weaponized, and the public uses the terms in ways that can be weaponized. And I think it's among other things, it serves the purpose of laying claim to a certain authority or legitimacy or validity that's actually not there. So if I say, well, I don't like this guy, he's an asshole, and here's why, it doesn't quite have the same weight as saying this person has narcissistic personality disorder, right? So I think people want to use these terms, right? Everything is toxic. Everything is trauma. Everyone who's, treated us badly is a narcissist. Among other things, I think I think it lays claim to an objectivity that's not there. It's like if somebody says, God, I had this really, shitty experience. It left me feeling awful. It's a little different from saying, that narcissist traumatized me. right? It's like it's like there's something going on in the culture, especially in recent years. It's like we have to keep escalating the language that we use to be taken seriously. It's not good enough anymore to say, I felt crappy about it and it bothered me afterward. We have to say I was traumatized. It's like, to sort of lay claim to the validity of our experience, we have to state it in, increasingly extreme terms, and we need to state it in, quasi pseudo medical or psychiatric sounding terms.
Is that our histrionic personality disorder shining through? Is that what's going on? Can you diagnose that? And that's a joke, but it's the laying claim to the objectivity, the escalation, but also it's betraying the ethos of of the spirit in which these ideas were developed. And I think getting back to and exploring the ethos in the context in which these ideas were developed can help us to spot the misuse in the wild and also slow down and not necessarily.
Really nicely said. I might have to plagiarize that in the future because you said it so well. And there's a lot of controversy, and I've kind of become a lightning rod for some of it on Twitter. That there's this. There's a lot of bad mental health practice out there. There are people who have been harmed by bad treatment. There's no question about it. There's people on social media like just have a vendetta against the mental health profession, and then it leads to this very sort of two-dimensional reductionistic diagnosis is bad, diagnosis is harmful. Psychiatric diagnosis is an evil enterprise that has to be dismantled. And what it misses is there's, you can use diagnostic terms to, you can weaponize them to dismiss or,
get your way
get your way, get the upper hand, dismiss or denigrate someone. But that's not what the language was, evolved for. So, if we make a diagnosis, say depression, to take the most common diagnosis that's likely to appear in somebody's medical record, is the function of coming up with that term, is the function to label and categorize someone, or is that a prologue for understanding something, constructive and useful that opens the door to help, right? So, is it a label, or is it, or is it the beginning of a process of, helping make things better for them?
Mm-hmm. I think
in popular culture, it's usually the former, though.
It becomes an identity, I think, on some level, how we're being reduced by our mediums of communication, the social media and stuff. It's highlighting this identity. We like a label. We need a label now to interface, and a lot of things become a part of our identity. And you framing it in terms of, let's just say, depression or narcissism or all these different kind of personality spins that people have. The identity isn't. Human being is a agent and is in flux and it persists throughout time, is really complex, is really unknown to itself, is constantly emerging in relationship with himself and other people around them. And I think it's really difficult for us to I don't think that we're necessarily trained to understand what a human being is in our culture, and so we are relying on very diminutive forms of what a human being is, and
ways of putting people in boxes or categories, and then we don't
and really ourselves included. We do that
ourselves included. And then we don't really have to think about or have to think about or encounter, the unknown, right? We get a category, and then we can treat ourselves or treat the other person, as a category, rather than the much more difficult and messier business of, encountering them for who they are, and discovering something, right? Why do I need to discover anything if I can put somebody in a category and I already know everything that I care to know about them before I find out anything more? And on like social media, on Twitter, that happens it happens in a nanosecond. One word, and one word that's either maybe not ideally expressed or that's misunderstood by someone, and all of a sudden you're on this side and against that side. And it was like, wait, I didn't actually say or think any of that. And you're misunderstanding me. And half of the time on Twitter, like, when that happens, I say you're misunderstanding me, the other person insists that they know better what I thought and intended than I did. Right? It's more important for them to hold on to their category than to be open to seeing and hearing and discovering something that maybe doesn't fit.
Yeah, the more, the older I get, or the more experience I have of myself, the more I realize I don't know myself, and the more silly it seems to have all these strangers claiming to know me better than I do, even though I've lived with myself and I still don't know.
That's probably a pretty good place to arrive at.
Yeah. Is there some part of you, or is there a hobby that you have that's completely different than considering these things, and something totally weird, like you make things with glue in a basement or something like that?
Well, I have a secret second life as a ski instructor.
Oh, really?
In Vail, Colorado.
Cool. Okay.
I've been a martial artist for many years. I haven't practiced much in recent years, but that's.
Were you were instructing skiing this season?
I was there over the holidays.
How was it? How's the
awesome
the season? Yeah.
It snowed and
yeah.
It was great. It's a pretty cool job. You like get paid money to go out and ski with people and and do something together that makes them happy.
Yeah. And experience that wonderful thing called gravity in a controlled manner, more or less, I guess, depending on your skill and the conditions at hand. Jonathan, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me and letting me pick your brain. I got a wealth out of you, so thank you.
Oh, thank you. It was fun and a good experience for me too.
Now I'm going to cut it down to 15-second clips and
like NPR.
Yeah.
Recording stopped.